Thank you so much for coming to our webinar. I think we'll start with introductions. So I'll be one of the co-hosts. I'm Elena, and I'm the Director of Chapters at STEM Fellowship.
I'm Nathan. I'm part of the chapters team here at STEM Fellowship. I'm a third year undergraduate at UBC. I'm studying physiology.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mohit. I've been part of STEM Fellowship for almost 2 years now, and I'm also the researcher for today.
So you've published a couple papers on COVID-19. So would you really just give us a quick rundown of what those were?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the papers is a hypothesis paper that focused on the potential use of tetracycline antibiotics to treat COVID-19. And the second one was a piece after all this frenzy about ibuprofen and COVID-19 and, the potential for risk of, worsening infection with ibuprofen use in COVID-19.
So about the ibuprofen one, what exactly was the controversy and what were the studies that show this? Because I haven't really heard a lot about it.
Yeah, so it all started when a French infectious disease specialist reported that there were some, I think, 4 young patients who reported having worsening symptoms after they took ibuprofen with COVID-19. And these were unpublished, these were anecdotal. And then it led to, there was a paper by Fang et al. In Lancet Respiratory Medicine, which just had one line in it that said that the ACE2 enzyme and ibuprofen together can actually increase the risk of worsening infection with COVID-19. And that was just a hypothesis. There was no basis per se on that statement. And sorry, one sec. Yeah, there's no basis on that statement per se. It's just a hypothesis. And then the French minister, I believe it was the health minister, he tweeted about not taking ibuprofen. And then the WHO, they said, we shouldn't be taking ibuprofen. Then a little bit later, they redacted their statement. And there's a huge media frenzy surrounding this. And to be honest, a lot of the studies that show worsening symptoms of pneumonia, which, as we know, is a main symptom or main outcome of COVID-19 infection, it actually does show an increase in the risk with NSAID use. However, these studies are subject to a number of different methodological biases. So taking their results with a massive grain of salt, or a bag of salt, if you will.
So in terms of this sort of ibuprofen situation, how can the scientific community then find a balance between offering a suitable therapeutic within a feasible time frame while also ensuring the safety of the treatment and that it's overall effective?
Are you saying that in terms of ibuprofen and COVID-19, or more the tetracyclines?
Or just in general, with finding medications that could be effective in treating COVID-19?
I think that's a great question. I think this is a new virus. There's a reason it's called the novel coronavirus, because it's never been seen in humans before. And with all this media frenzy going around and all these treatments coming out and these potential treatments and things that can worsen it and whatnot, there's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of information to begin with. And we really, as a society and scientists and everyone, are doing their best to put out as much information as we can. So in terms of the ibuprofen, for example, because there's no previous studies that we can say, look at these previous patients with COVID-19 who, have had these symptoms, or there's no epi studies. There's very few basic science studies before all this stuff happened. So we have to really, take everything with a grain of salt, especially in the beginning, while all this new research is being conducted. And then, it'd be easy to say, a year or two later that, this treatment worked, this didn't work, that worked. But right now, because this is all so new to us, things are changing every day. And, I think it's just best to make sure to read the literature, read the scientific studies, follow the example of, set by the WHO, Health Canada, things like that.
I think you touched on this a little bit, but what would be the potential dangers of miscommunication between the scientific community and the general population? Such as, I mean, I'm sure everyone has seen Trump's multiple tweets online.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the knowledge translation that we get from science to the general public is of utmost importance. We already see people, panic buying, and like you mentioned, Trump's tweets and his press conferences about injecting disinfectants and things like that. So I think it's very important that we have to read the literature. We have to understand it, and people in power have to be able to communicate that properly, and they have to communicate it in an eloquent manner, so it's also understood by the general public. Another example from Trump was the highly touted hydroxychloroquine. So one bad thing that happened because of that is that with hydroxychloroquine, an already known side effect of it is prolonged QT interval time, so it causes heart problems. But when he was touting it, he wasn't necessarily mentioning that, nor was he mentioning any other potential side effects of this drug. And then some people went off and took it. And then I believe there was a case report where someone who took it, and then they actually ended up dying or worsening, I believe, because they want to listen to him. And the same thing goes with all the bleach and disinfectants and things like that. So I think it's really important that these messages are very clear and concise in what they mean.
So moving on to your work on tetracyclines, would you be able to talk a little bit about some of the benefits of using existing drugs like tetracyclines to treat COVID-19?
Yeah, so repurposing drugs is not necessarily a new idea that was brought in because of this pandemic. For example, Benadryl, it's actually repurposed, or has been repurposed, as a sleeping aid because it can make you tired in addition to treating your allergy symptoms. So I think it's very important that we look at existing drugs to help buy some time for research into finding a vaccine or more efficacious treatments to help prevent and treat COVID-19. So a lot of these drugs, like for example with tetracyclines, they're very, very well studied drugs. We know their safety, their side effect profile and the safety of them. Same goes for hydroxychloroquine, same goes for remdesivir. These are all drugs that we already know and have been established in society for a long time. Some of them are on the WHO's list of essential medicines. So we already know what these side effects are. So while potentially treating some cases, we also know what the potential harms of these drugs are. So because the vaccine is about 12 to 18 months away, optimistically, this could potentially buy us some time to do some proper research in finding something that's effective.
So you mentioned multiple drugs that are currently doing research, and you did publish a paper on tetracyclines, but would you just be able to talk about what exactly tetracyclines are and what the mechanisms for tetracyclines and COVID-19 actually are?
Yeah, for sure. So tetracyclines, I'm sure most of you here or who will watch later have been prescribed a tetracycline at some point in their life. So those include minocycline, doxycycline. There's also a drug called tetracycline. So it's an antibiotic, and it's used to treat a host of different bacterial infections. It could be from inner ear infections to UTIs to a whole bunch of different things. And it's weird because as scientists, we know that a basic rule of thumb is don't treat a viral infection with an antibiotic. But it's actually interesting because this antibiotic has shown to treat viral infections before, and quite efficaciously as well. So in terms of COVID-19 and tetracyclines, there's three mechanisms that we highlighted in our paper. The first is that it inhibits viral replication in viruses similar to COVID-19. I believe those are positive sense single-stranded RNA molecules. So like the dengue virus, there's a research that found that at normal human conditions, temperature-wise, as well as fever conditions, that they decrease the retroviral load by about 70%. And mind you, it is an in vitro study, but I mean, we have to go based off of what has been done before. The second mechanism is that it reduces inflammation within the body. So I'm sure everyone's heard about the cytokine storms that are induced because of COVID-19 infection. And one thing about tetracyclines is that they reduce that amount of inflammation. So they reduce those cytokines. They inhibit mast cell release of, IL-1 beta, of IL-6, of the NFK beta pathway. So in that sense, it could potentially decrease the amount of inflammation with a COVID-19 infection. And the third thing was that it's high tissue penetration. So we've heard so many times that, just wash your hands, wash your hands, wash your hands, right? And why is that? That's because the virus itself is surrounded by a lipophilic shell. So when you wash your hands with soap, it actually breaks down that outer shell, and then it washes away in the sink. So tetracyclines are also very lipophilic. So when you take a tetracycline, it could potentially degrade that outer layer and penetrate into the virus itself. It also it can penetrate tissue very well. So we know that COVID-19 affects the lungs quite severely, and things like pneumonia, ARDS, those are all negative outcomes of it. So with tetracyclines, they're already given for pneumonia anyways. But when you take a tetracycline, it can really penetrate the lung tissue quite well. It's actually shown to increase the amount of tissue penetration, decrease sepsis and ARDS with other types of infections, which is quite promising. And one other thing that I found was quite interesting was that a couple of weeks after we published this paper, there was a supercomputer, which it did a whole bunch of algorithms, and I'm not very good with computers, so I don't know the proper terms, but it did a whole bunch of calculations with existing drugs. And it came up with a list of, I believe it was 68 or 69 different existing compounds that could potentially treat COVID-19. And I believe about 10 of them were actually tetracyclines. So that's kind of interesting to see that, a while after, a computer is much smarter than myself. So, that just lends credence to the hypothesis. It might work.
Could you talk a little bit about how potential treatments might change if the virus were to mutate?
Yeah, we are seeing that there are different strains of the virus coming out right now, different mutations, and I think that it really depends on the severity or the degree of the mutation itself. I'm not a genetics expert, but based off my own knowledge of what I know, that the greater the change in the genome of the virus itself, the harder it will be for us as a society and as scientists to really adjust to that. So we start off at square one with the virus, that we don't necessarily have a treatment for this. But as it starts to mutate, and if there's different strains of it, depending if it's a fairly small mutation, it might be a little bit easier for us to get around, because if we come out, for example, with a compound X that can treat the original COVID-19, and then it starts to mutate, but those mutations are still attacked by compound X that we've identified, then it won't be, too frustrating to move on with different treatments. However, if the genome changes a lot more and it becomes resistant to compound X that we initially identified, then that could, put us back, some months or some years in term, depending on where we are along the pipeline, in terms of finding a treatment for these new strains now. And we see that, for example, with the flu all the time, you have to get different vaccines, you have to get, there's different treatments for different types of flus. So it'll be quite challenging depending on the degree of genome change.
On the topic of treatments, there's been a lot of news recently about all the different drugs that are being tested, and I know people are really looking forward to having a treatment that actually works, because that'd be really helpful to stop the pandemic. But what would you say are the most promising drugs that are being looked at right now?
That's a good question. I would say it's still pretty early to really comment on that. I think remdesivir, that was just in the news. I believe that Dr. Fauci from the United States, he led that study, and it was published in the Lancet a few days ago. And they looked at remdesivir and the outcomes and things like that. And then the FDA, after seeing that study, they actually initiated an emergency protocol where doctors are allowed to give remdesivir to patients suffering from COVID-19. After reading the paper, I think that it still might be a little bit premature, but I mean, the results were somewhat promising. They're better than hydroxychloroquine. I mean, I don't want to, I guess maybe I'm biased in a way, but I think tetracyclines are looking fairly promising. We're actually running a few clinical trials around the world right now. So far, it looks pretty good, but nothing has been published on it yet, and we still have to complete the trial. And I believe the other drugs that they were looking at, as was chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. I believe azithromycin was also used in that trial as well, along with hydroxychloroquine. I can't quite remember, but those are some of the main drugs that are being looked at right now. And I mean, every day people are publishing different hypothesis papers and things like that with different existing compounds on what could potentially treat it right now. I know from UBC as well, they published something in Cell that was in the news quite a bit a few weeks ago of a novel compound, I believe, that was shown to decrease viral replication with COVID-19. So, I mean, once trials start running for that, I'm sure that there's potential for that as well.
Could you talk a little bit about why these treatments and vaccines take so long to make?
Yeah, for sure. So as we all know from, even grade 5, grade 7 science, is that, about the scientific method. So taking your time, having, replicable results. And I think that because this is a novel virus, we've never seen this before, it will take a lot of time to really be able to, it's one thing if you have like a promising drug and you have one trial and then boom, everything's all good. But with science, you can't do that. You have to take your time. You have to have, use that drug and have multiple trials. You have to look at like, will this actually work in different groups? Another thing is that with drug safety studies and drug efficacy studies, and a new virus like this, is that you have to not only look at whether a drug works or not, you have to look at whether it's safe as well. So there's two components to it. So you have to have both components before moving on. You can't just have a drug that works, but might kill someone else because of some other disease. And same way around. You can have a drug that's safe, but if it doesn't work, then there's no point in administering it. So that takes a long time. And I mean, even something like HIV, which we've studied and known about for such a long time, there's still no vaccine for that. Everyone's working as fast as they can, as hard as they can. I know I am. I know my supervisor is, as well as hundreds of other international collaborators. But that all takes time, and it would be wrong to be very hasty in sending out treatments or vaccines without having the proper research behind it.
Yeah, that's definitely really important. There's this other thing that was in the news recently, but do we know that the presence of antibodies in an individual means that they're immune to COVID-19?
Oh, that's a good question. Unfortunately, antibodies and basic science stuff is not necessarily my area of expertise, but based off what I do know and from seeing the news and my own literature knowledge and things like that, that it's not necessarily the case. Just because someone has COVID-19 and has the antibodies for it doesn't necessarily mean that they're immune to it. I know that, I'm pretty sure at least that in some cases in China where it all started, at least where people believe it started, people have actually become reinfected by COVID-19. And that poses a bit of a problem, because when you're coming up with a virus, when you're coming up with a vaccine for it, you have to rely on your own body's antibodies to be able to protect yourself from a future infection. So we have to find a way to isolate these antibodies where it can actually, destroy the virus if you're reinfected by it at a future date. So, I mean, the research is still preliminary right now, but so far it's looking that there is the potential to be reinfected by that.
And lastly, before we open it up to questions, what can we do at this point to help stop the spread? Given where we're at now, and with provinces starting to think about coming back and getting back to normal, so to speak.
Yeah, so I think until we come up with a vaccine that works, we're looking at a very different form of normal right now. in terms of what we can do, all I can say is what all the knowledgeable people who are much smarter than myself, Dr. Bonnie Henry in BC, Dr. Teresa Tam, on the federal level, Dr. Anthony Fauci if you're in the States, listen to what they're saying. Everyone knows, wash your hands for 20 seconds, maintain your social distance from people who are not within your household. Be kind. I mean, that goes a long way as well. Take care of yourself, both physically and mentally. And I think that, there's also been a lot of research showing out, and coming out that, if you wear a mask, just even a homemade cloth mask, to prevent the infection to other people. So if you're asymptomatic, for example, and you have COVID-19, if you cough or whatever, at least that is the equivalent of coughing into your elbow. So doing things like that, I think that can really help out with, aside from flattening the curve, but, diminishing that curve as well.
Okay, so that's all the questions that we had prepared. If anyone has any of their own questions, please type them in the chat and then we'll answer them right now. If you don't have any questions off the top of your head, you can just message us on social media and we'll reply back afterwards. So we'll just stay for a couple more minutes and see if anyone has questions. Okay, so the question is, how effective do you think the current social distancing measures will be to preventing the spread of COVID-19?
That's a good question. I think, as we know, the 6 feet, 2 meters, if you're from Canada, then 1 hockey stick length away from someone else. I think it is obviously very effective. I was reading a paper, and one of the main things that they talked about with decreasing the prevention and spread of COVID-19 is the social distancing. So I think that it is effective, and there is research that shows this. I remember a few weeks ago there's a paper that came out by some engineers where they would have people cough into a chamber, and then it would measure the distance that droplets would go. And I believe that they said that it could travel up to 9 to 12 feet. And that obviously caused a bit of stir with the whole 6 feet versus 12 feet and all that kind of stuff. But I think that what they justified is that, the most infectious particles, which have the greatest viral load, they're the heaviest. So if you happen to spray or tuck moistly, as Mr. Trudeau said, then the heaviest droplets, the most infectious droplets, would fall closest to you, not the other person. So I think the 6 feet, people who are much smarter than myself have, initiated this, and it seems to be working so far, at least in places where people are abiding by this.
Yeah, I did see, I think it was on the WHO, that COVID-19 was by droplet transmission rather than airborne transmission, just like a subtle difference.
Yeah.
The next question was, do you think it's a good idea that restrictions are being partially lifted in Canada?
Yeah, like I said, I'm just relaying it back to the people who are much smarter than myself, who are at the top of the food chain right now. But I think that, it's, they're going through a difficult time just as much as us, in the sense that they have to be able to balance, having the safety of the population versus, starting up the economy and people's livelihoods and well-being and things like that. So I think that it's important that we implement, very slowly. Like I don't know where a lot of you are from, but in BC, I think we have a 4-phase plan to, start, opening things up, having hairdressers and all those kind of things that we wish that we had. It's easy for me because I just, take a, buzz cut to my head. But a lot of other people, they want to get their hair done, they want to go to restaurants, they want to socialize, they want to do all these kind of things. So I think that it's important that we, we do it slowly. We don't want to just open the floodgates like they are doing in some other parts of the world. But I think that it is important to maintain that balance between, having, the economy flowing and having people out doing jobs and things like that, while also, maintaining, the safety of the population as well. So it's a very fine balance. And I think that the best way to do it, like they're doing right now, is doing it very slowly and making sure that everyone is safe, that there's measures implemented, like having the plexiglass barriers, wearing masks if you go places, maintaining social distance and all those kind of things, to mitigate the risk of, a worse second wave.
Yeah, I definitely agree, because I do work at Digging right now, and it has been really hard on business because we had to open half days for a couple of weeks. So I think we lost maybe 60% of our revenue, but we do have like the plexiglass barriers and hand washing procedures and everything. We have another question. It's, do you think antibiotic resistance will be a problem later on after the pandemic due to different antibiotics that are being tested?
I laugh when I see that question, is because someone commented on that. There was a Reddit article about our paper, and that was one of the concerns that someone raised oh so eloquently. I think that, yes, I do think that, like we've known about the antibiotic resistance. We've known about that for a long time. We know that, it's just getting worse more and more. But right now I think it's, and this is just my personal opinion, is, that I think that right now we're facing a pandemic right now where thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are dying because of this virus. And I think it's kind of, life before limb in a way. So let's try to figure out this pandemic first. Let's come up with a useful, technique to deal with this pandemic. And I mean, it's not like, like obviously with antibiotic use, you have your own set of problems, like you mentioned, antibiotic resistance and things like that. But, there's also, like I touched upon before, with other drugs, there's also, side effects of those as well. And you can consider antibiotic resistance in the way of a side effect. So I think that, like I mentioned with hydroxychloroquine, it can lead to heart problems and things like that, whether it's, within a couple of days of taking it or maybe, a few weeks after. So I think that, it's about weighing the pros and cons. That's what, this medicine is all about, is, weighing, like a drug wouldn't be a drug if it didn't have side effects. So I think it's important to, weigh those positives and negatives, and then, go forward, based off of the scientific literature and based off of, what the best protocol and treatment is at the time.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. We have another question. It's, do you think COVID-19 will mutate drastically before a vaccine is found?
Like I said earlier, genomics is not one of my areas of specialty. But I mean, it could. I'm sorry, I can't give you a better answer. I think, there's a possibility for anything, right? If it does, mutate drastically, then obviously, like I mentioned earlier, that'll pose a whole host of different problems, because then we're going to be, you take 2 steps forward and 5 steps back, in a sense that, we'll have to remap the entire genome of this. You essentially have to treat it like a new virus in a way. If it mutates drastically, and that's how you have to treat it, then you have to start looking at other compounds that can treat that strain versus treating the previous strain. So, it could. It really depends on how quickly we find a vaccine. Even after we create a vaccine for it, it's entirely possible that the virus can even mutate after that. So, let's hope for the best.
Yeah, definitely. It is hard to say a lot of things, especially since we're in the middle of the pandemic.
Yeah, hindsight is 2020. But it's hard to predict what's going to happen going forward. At the beginning of this year, I don't think we would have had to deal with as much burdens that we've had to deal with in 2020. So,
I guess it has been an interesting year.
Yeah.
What do you think the long-term impacts will be on healthcare due to COVID-19?
That's Long-term impacts. Well, I mean, I think that, it's crazy, the society we live in today, just being like, people say, like, what a time to be alive. Never in my life did I think that, we would be, I think it became real for me because I'm a huge sports fan, when the NBA got canceled, the NHL got canceled, and all those things happened. I think that's when it really hit me and it became real. So I think that, there will be a lot of different changes. So I think that, I'm not part of the government. I don't know what playing a role, but I think that over time, they're going to start putting money in different places. There's going to be, more security measures, job stability, hopefully. And I think, in terms of, not just healthcare. I mean, we're seeing a lot of people working from home. So I think that will also change as well. In terms of healthcare, I mean, yeah, hopefully, things will start changing, that we'll have, more efficient system, maybe having more telemedicine, things like that. But I mean, it's really hard to say. But I mean, I don't think that these emergency protocols that we've initiated in the country and in the world are not going to go away anytime soon, because of the possibility of second, third, fourth wave. So the next couple of years, this will start to be our new normal. We'll start to get used to it. Eventually, I hope that things will go back to what our normal is, but that won't happen for a while. And hopefully that this whole pandemic will be a wake-up call, not just for Canada or the US, but the entire world, to see, highlight where the areas of problem are within each respective healthcare system.
Yeah, I really hope that like the positive changes that we've implemented do stay, because I know for the SARS outbreak, which was like a decade ago now, we did implement a lot better communication procedures, because for SARS there was basically no communication between China and the rest of the world for the first few months.
Yeah, I think that, oh, sorry, go ahead. If someone was talking, go ahead. Oh, yeah, no, I was just saying that, like this, in a time where the world is so divided, before this, I think that this is a time where, hopefully we can see that we're stronger as a unit, as opposed to, as a group, as separate parts. I don't know how many people have watched The Walking Dead, but I've seen bits and parts of it. And one thing that always surprised me whenever I watched it is that why, there's this big pandemic and all this stuff going on. Why are separate groups of people fighting each other for resources and things like that? It would make a lot more sense to me if people collaborated and came up with novel ideas and novel solutions to, cure the disease and fix the zombies, or, get rid of the zombies or whatever, right? So, I mean, it's funny to think about, but, I mean, hopefully this can highlight the fact that, as a world, as a collective unit, we're stronger than, the separate parts.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so the question is, there's been an outpouring of scientific studies and papers being published at a far more rapid pace than it generally does. Do you think this pandemic will have long-reaching effects in the future for researchers and the rate of publishing?
That's a good question. I mean, I think right now, with the pandemic and everything, every time you go to submission site for a journal, the priority is COVID-related papers. They give some warning about, there's an inpouring of COVID papers, and they're only selecting, the most critical ones, the ones with the most public health impact. So I think that in terms of the long-reaching effects, I think in terms of publishing, things may go back to more normal than before. I think that right now journals understand that this is a huge problem. Like, stop the bleeding. Anything that can help progress research in the world. I think that'll, that's kind of what they're prioritizing right now. The biggest public health impacts. In the future, I don't know. Anything can happen. It could affect different things. But right now, it's like I said before, it's life before limb. Journals are trying to get as much information out as possible with the greatest public health impact. So whether that continues over the next year, 2 years, 5 years in relation to COVID, I mean, maybe, but right now we're in a critical juncture right now where we need as much information out there as possible. So all I can speak for is right now, not 5 years down the line. I'm sure, God forbid another pandemic occur again, I'm sure that the same thing would apply for journals and things like that. So yeah. To answer your question, I'm sorry if I can't give a more concrete concrete idea.
I mean, I also heard that for SARS, there was a lot of research reported in the beginning, but after the entire pandemic was over, a lot of research funding got cut, so they weren't able to continue, which is unfortunate because that could have potentially helped with COVID-19 research.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a trickling in of SARS-related papers, 2 years, 5 years. I remember we cited a couple papers that had to do with SARS, and I think the SARS pandemic was in 2003, 2004, and there's some papers, 2005, 2006, but obviously it wasn't as much as it would be now. And I think that, for COVID, hopefully, we learn from our mistakes. And we adjust things accordingly.
Okay, there's a follow-up, which is following off of that. Do you think it should go back to what the norm was? And are there any pros to what you see right now?
Yeah, I'll answer your second question first. So in terms of pros of what we have right now, like I said, we need to get as much information out as fast as possible. And, I think that that's really, really good because we have to stop the bleeding first. Life over limb, we have to, come up with ways to solve this pandemic right now. On the other hand, I know that there's other very important topics, that journals may not be able to accept right now because, they're being flooded with, COVID papers. So, for example, an article that may have been accepted by, I don't know, the BMJ, 2 years ago or a year ago may not be accepted right now, even though it may be of, great public importance. It's not, COVID is kind of taking precedence over that right now. So I think it's a bit of a trade-off. I know that in terms of my research, we still continued other, our other normal forms of research, but we definitely, sat down and we plowed through as much COVID stuff as we could, and we still are right now. So I know a lot of research groups are definitely shifting their focus from what their normal research is to focus on COVID. In terms of if I think it should go back to what the norm was, yeah, I think eventually over time it will. Hopefully, I don't know if I should say hopefully or not, but I think that we have a big problem right now that needs solving. So yeah, I think over time, things will probably eventually shift back to, looking at a wide array of different topics and journals publishing different things. But right now we have to deal with the crisis that we have right now. Sorry, did that answer your question again?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, if anyone has any questions, please type them now. If not, then thanks for joining us.